Welcome back everybody to the Braeden YouTube channel. Today is episode 3 of the K24 EM1 all-wheel drive build, and we're going to be working on the intake manifold and its related components today. So let's dive in. So in the last couple videos we've been pretty much dealing with all Honda parts. We put a Honda VTC actuator, Honda oil pump, and oil pan on this thing. We swapped out an Element EGR passage, and then we used a Honda bolt, and we did use a low-dollar motorsport sensor, good stuff there, and a K-tuned heater return plug. But today we're going to be diving into some aftermarket stuff. We do have another Honda part. We have a Honda RBC intake manifold here. This is 06 to 11 SI intake. These are actually quite good. They make quite a bit of power, and you saw the modifications we made. To get that on the engine, we have a Speed Factory thermal gasket here. This does a really good job of blocking heat from the head from soaking into the intake manifold, and on top of that, these are reusable. So for guys like me that are pushing these things and inevitably going to put a hole through the side of that thing, this will be nice because we can take that off and just replace it. We have a Honda throttle body gasket here. You can get a thermal gasket for this as well, but as you saw in the last video, we blocked off the water from right here that goes to the throttle body, so there's no more throttle body here. And then if you took off the black pipe here for the heater, there's a return in the pipe somewhere around this area, so that's gone as well. So there's no more water going to the throttle body, so we don't have to worry about a thermal gasket there. This shouldn't get warm unless you know, of course, from just ambient heat in the engine compartment and or the boost coming through from the turbo will definitely warm that up a little bit, but that's nothing you can't avoid. It's something you can avoid with a thermal gasket anyway. So moving on, if you follow the Instagram, you saw that we have a Radium Auto fuel setup on this intake manifold here. We have their fuel rail, we have their fuel pressure regulator and its two related components. We have a fuel pulse damper, which is actually really nice. This is the lower of the two. This is a 40 to 75 psi base pressure range, so that'll be perfect for me. I don't plan on running anywhere near even 30 pounds of boost on this thing, so that will fall in that thing's window just fine. We have the fuel pressure gauge here as well, which I'm not sure you'll see. I'm not sure I'm going to use this necessarily. We'll see about setting base pressure initially, but it may just come right back off depending on how all this fits. We have another low-dollar motorsports sensor here. You guys are noticing a trend with me on these things, I'm sure. This is 0 to 150 psi, and this is for fuel pressure. We have a Speed Factory 4-bar map sensor here, just a factory style. It'll go right on the intake manifold right there. Then we have ID 1700 injectors. I actually bought these at 30% off because I sent my old 2000s to T1 Race Development. So T1, their injector cleaning service is in Arizona. They're actually in Texas, but I sent my old 2000s there to have them cleaned because I'm a bad injector owner and I left E85 sitting in them and it destroyed them. So if you don't want to destroy $1,000 worth of injectors, make sure you run 93 through them, or you put some sort of lubricant in them, take them off, fill them with WD-40, whatever you got to do, because that was really expensive. These are 1700s. They're a little bit smaller. These should be able to support about 750 horsepower on that engine specifically on E85, so these will do just fine for my goals right now. I may have to go bigger or run a dual injector setup at some point, but I'm definitely going to be more careful with these. So the fact that T1 couldn't save them, they sold me these at 30% off, which was really nice. So if you have any injectors with them, send them in to have them cleaned. If they can get them back into spec, they'll give them back to you and they'll be just fine. If they can't, then they will work with you and give you 30% off your next set of injectors. And then we just have some hardware for the fuel rail. We'll have to go over how this works. I do have a little bit of a gripe with this with Radium, but I think I can get over it. We'll see. But yeah, that's the stuff that we have to put on right now. So what we're going to do is just go ahead and throw on the time lapse and get started putting the intake on the engine initially, and then we'll kind of break out and go from there with all these other parts. So now that I'm finally putting some aftermarket parts on this engine, it feels good again. The last engine I had was that 600 horsepower B series in this thing, and it was so much fun. It was far more built than this. This thing should make the same numbers and more torque than that engine did, but it's been 2 years since I've had this car running and making power, so it'll feel good to finally be putting some aftermarket parts on this thing. So I'm excited about this video. Let's put some stuff on here and keep moving towards getting this thing running again. Okay, so we've got our intake manifold mounted with our Speed Factory thermal gasket. We've got the Speed Factory 4-bar map sensor in there, as well as the TSX throttle body. I went ahead and threw this on because there's nothing too groundbreaking here. The only thing is we are running an electronic throttle body in here. I know a lot of guys go cable. The computer that I'm using has the ability to run a drive-by-wire throttle, so we're going to be mounting a DBW pedal in the car. The only thing is the TSX throttle body had the output, or I guess the vacuum port for the brake booster on the throttle, whereas the SI had it on the intake manifold. So I'll just end up pulling this out, drilling and tapping this. Again, nothing too groundbreaking there either. I'll basically just do what I did here and just cap that off. Or I may use it for something, but I think it's, you know, kind of looks weird with two of those ports right there. I may use it for blow-off valve or something, I'm not sure. Anyway, the next step here is to go into how to mount this thing. So this thing, this fuel rail is so big that it has to use a different style bolt. So the first thing we got to do is pull these studs out of here. And the best way to go about that is to get two M8 125 bolts, nuts, and put one on upside down, put the other one on right side up, and jam them together. And then you can use them to walk that stud out of there. So that's the first thing we're going to do here, and then we'll work on getting the this whole system mounted on the engine. The studs are out now, so the reasoning behind pulling these studs, one, they're not long enough to go through this fuel rail. The other thing is this fuel rail is such a big bore. You can see how big around it is. You see how close that bore comes to where those bolts are right here. So the idea is using a slimmer bolt like this. But before we can mount this fuel rail, some assembly is required. We have to put on the fuel pulse damper and put the injectors in it at least. Then we'll put the bolts through it. We'll use the Honda spacers here that come on pretty much every K series there is. And then we can slap this thing on and put the fuel pressure regulator and the pressure transducer on. The Radium Engineering fuel rail and fuel pulse damper are on, along with the bolts that they sent. I also have the ID 1700 injectors in there, and that is a nice looking setup. Very subtle, yet it's got their information on it. I really like this setup. The only gripe I had with it initially was the fact that these bolts right here don't hold these spacers when you take them out. So like if you're at the track or something and you got to diagnose or replace an injector, if that thing falls, you're screwed. So that's the one gripe that I had, but I totally understand why these bolts are here, because there's just not space for a nut. This bar is huge. This fuel rail is massive. So anyway, the only other thing I see here is that this is going to interfere with the connector here, and I don't want to turn this injector because it changes the spray pattern. So I'll have to, you know, do some creative engineering, I guess, there to get that to clear that injector connector. But the next step here is going to be to assemble the fuel pressure regulator and get that installed with its sensor. Alright, so as far as this fuel pressure regulator is concerned, it has these fittings on it that are like free moving. So when you put them in, when they're tight, you can still rotate them as much as you want. So that'll be really nice to kind of like fine tuning how my fuel return and how the regulator are oriented in the car. So the first thing you got to do here is determine where this thing's going to go, which I already know. So it's going to go on the side of the fuel rail on the driver's side of the engine. So what we got to do is put in the fuel rail to fuel pressure regulator fitting here. And then tighten it down. Get it pretty tight, don't have to kill it. Should be just fine to be like that. But as you can see, that fitting, that center section there, is not rotating, but I can rotate the nut, so that'll allow this regulator to kind of float, and I can put it wherever I need it. So then the next one is to put on the actual fuel return fitting here, and it uses a smaller Allen key. So now the fuel pressure regulator is assembled, and then we're going to put it on the engine. But first, what we need to do, it's going to sit in the engine like this. It's actually going to face the head cover. The head cover will be right here. What we need to do is put on the fuel pressure gauge and the fuel pressure sensor. Like I said, I'm not sure if this thing's going to stay because it kind of limits how this thing can sit. But for now, it's going to be there. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, and they send a fitting here to block it off if we need to. So I'm going to put some Teflon tape on this and throw it on the engine. Alright, so the fuel pressure regulator, gauge, and sensor are on, and as you can see, when they are oriented with the engine's, rearward leaning angle, everything fits nicely. This is all right here, and everything's great. But when you straighten things up and then try to get this to stand straight up and down, it hits the intake manifold. So that's kind of a bummer. This thing needs to sit like this, and that gauge being angled backwards is just going to look weird. So the idea is eventually to maybe take the gauge off and then have the sensor aiming forward and the engine cover kind of covering this thing up. But honestly, just it being like that, or not having the gauge and just being like that and having the harness run down through there would be just fine. But regardless, Radium, super nice stuff. And then depending on how I want to run my return line, I can angle this, whatever I want to do, which I'll probably angle it and run it right down through there. But yeah, looks good. So the last thing to do in this video to kind of complete the intake manifold setup, for now anyway, is to put the brake booster vacuum source back on and cut it to length and attach it to the intake manifold there. So let's go ahead and do that real quick, and then we'll be able to wrap this up. Alright, so I got this cut down to length, but there was one small concern, and I'm not sure if you can see it, but down in that pipe there is a restrictor. Got a little bit of glimpse of it there. And it's not a one-way valve, it literally just looks like a little restrictor. I'm going to cut it out of there, but the only reason I'm okay with that not being there is because I'm going to hook the brake pipe that's in the car that has the one-way valve in it and everything up to here, and before it went right to the intake manifold. So that means that there being no restrictors, valving, or anything in this, it should operate just fine. And honestly, I'm not really entirely sure that I'm going to keep that brake booster a whole lot longer. I may just completely get rid of it to make space for the turbo to sit right here. But for now, I know that this will be okay because that pipe worked fine hooked right up to the intake, because on the B series it was on the back. Anyway, let's cut this thing out of here and see what the hell that was. So I got it cut out of there, and it literally just looks like a bigger version of something you'd find on like a necklace you'd build in grade school. It's just a bead. Looks like it was just like a, I don't know, a flow restrictor or like a velocity restrictor of some sort in the brake pipe. But again, not necessary, just curiosity there. So with that, we conclude episode 3 of the K24 build for the all-wheel drive Civic. It feels really good to be getting to this point. We've got some really good Speed Factory components on this engine, the map sensor and the intake gasket. We've got Radium engineering fuel components. The pulse damper is a big thing for me. I'm really excited to see how much of a difference that thing makes. The fuel pressure regulator is super nice because it moves around and is kind of free floating. Of course, we've got the ID 1700cc injectors. None of this can happen without good injectors, and they are pivotal in whether or not this engine will operate properly. And then on top of that, we've got the low dollar motorsport sensors all over it, and I'm excited to see how those work out and what kind of data I can collect with them to help this stock engine go as far as any one of them has ever gone before. So that's the goal here. But that's it for episode 3. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate it. Like, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.